stereo. But he's been known to go in the house and take a nap and leave the stereo going. For 3-4 hours. Don't see the guy. Now he comes back out. It's hard to love a neighbor like that. But notice the Bible, Jesus just says, love your neighbor as yourself. And in fact, I had never put that into context. This is from Leviticus, which is the third book of the Bible. Turn there real quick. Leviticus chapter 19. I had never put this in context before. Shame on you, preacher. That's what you're supposed to be thinking right now. Shame on you, preacher. All the way through Bible college, you never put this in context? No, I really didn't. And the context just kind of blows me away. This is what God says, and Jesus quotes it. And remember, the Jews of this time, they would have had this memorized. They would know this. When Jesus said, love the Lord, love your neighbor as yourself, they knew what came around it, but I don't. I'm a Gentile. I have to go back. Pick it up in verse 16. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. In other words, don't go around lying about somebody. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Now, let me just put that. That's God saying, I'm God. Are you listening? As parents, sometimes you have to tell your children no to do something or to not do something, yes or no, right? And sometimes you just have to say it's because I'm your parent, right? I didn't understand that. I wanted my parents to reason with me. Stop it! I'm the parent. Listen to me, kid. And God says that when he says this, I am the Lord. Okay, end of discussion. This is enough for argument. Verse 17. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share his guilt. In other words, when your neighbor messes up, go over and say, hey man, I think you messed up here. Straight up. Verse 18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but, context, love your neighbor as yourself. And, by the way, I am the Lord. Oh, so you don't like that? Well, guess what? I'm the Lord. I'm God. Tough. Do I like that? I don't like that. I don't want to love that neighbor. I don't want to love the guy that just cut me off. I don't want a guy that does this, there, that. But God says, I am God. Do it. Isn't it amazing? We tell our kids that, but when we get to be adults, we still struggle with it, don't we? We just don't really like authority. And that's why a lot of people run from God. They just don't want God's authority in their lives. I get it. And we already saw in the Ten Commandments that the first 4, they all started with doing right by God, right? Okay? I'm the only God. Don't have any idols. Don't use my name in vain. Work on that in your texting on your Facebook pages, kids. And then finally, keep the Sabbath. Keep the Sabbath. Keep the day of worship. The next 6 of the commandments, now let's go back to Exodus 20 again. The next 6 of the commandments deal with our vertical relationship. That's our horizontal relationship, our relationship with God. Okay, the first 4. The next 6 deal with our horizontal relationships, those relationships we have here on earth with other humans. Let's start with those. Verse 12. Here's commandment number 5. Here's what it says. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Do you know how long you have to honor your father and your mother? Till you graduate from high school. Then you have to, no. Forever. Even when they're dead. Even when they're gone. You have to honor your father and your mother. Some of you didn't have great moms and dads. Straight up. The Bible doesn't make an exception to that. You have to honor your father and your mother. By the way, isn't it interesting? That's where he starts. Right after God, what's the next most important relationship in your life? Mom and dad. Learn to honor them. It can be tough, but you will be blessed when you do. So what's the next one? The next one is, do not commit murder. Don't whack your neighbor even when he needs it. Okay, I'm all for Texas justice. Yeah, I shot him because he needed shooting. You know, I get that, but no, you're not supposed to kill somebody in cold-blooded murder. Next one, do not commit adultery. That says, get married, have sex with nobody but the person you're married to. That's exactly what that says. And adultery, in its key, is breaking of a covenant. Next to God, what is your most holy covenant on earth? Is to be to your husband or your wife. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. What could that possibly mean? The Bible's so hard to understand. Is anybody getting things? Don't steal. If it's not yours, what? Don't touch it. Next, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. That's like slandering, and it's like lying, and it's like gossiping. And number 6, or number 10, depending on how you're counting here, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or his ox, or his donkey, or his motorcycle, or his Corvette, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now that's context. In other words, you shouldn't look over the fence and say, man, that $1,800 barbecue grill would look better on my patio than his. I get it. I get it. I don't drive old cars because I love old cars. I drive old cars because I can't afford new ones. And my neighbors drive up in their new ones, and it's, hey, boy! My one neighbor down he's got a 69 Camaro. He's completely done a frame off. Nothing original about the car. And that's kind of cool, but I don't want it. But that's another issue. But folks, human nature. We have to have love that is so powerful that it keeps us from doing wrong. And that's so much more powerful than fear. Now, a lot of people say, well, I don't do that because God's going to hit me with a lightning bolt and turn me into a pile of ashes. That's a motivation. But guess what? It's not the best one. When you love somebody, that you would give your life for them without question. That's the greatest motivation. That's why we build memorials to firefighters and policemen and to our soldiers and to people who are hurt when they're running to help someone else. That's the ultimate sacrifice. And love is so much more powerful and enriching and fulfilling than fear, whether it's love for God or love for your neighbor. And Jesus did more than just command us to love, which brings us to our second part about this great commandment today. The great commandment was demonstrated by Jesus. The great commandment was demonstrated by Jesus. And after the Last Supper, after he had the supper with the 12 in the upper room, Judas is now gone. Judas has went and he is gone to the Sanhedrin to tell Jesus, or to tell them where they can arrest him. It says at the end of chapter 14 of John, because we're going to go in John chapter 15, because I think their Gospel of John chapter 15. It says there at the end of 14, come now, let us leave. Jesus is quoted there. So they're leaving the upper room. We don't know if he's teaching this as they go, or if they get to the Garden of Gethsemane. And before Jesus divides them up into 2 groups, the larger group and then the smaller group of the inner circle disciples. Then he takes on a little bit further. And then he goes on further and he sweats drops of blood. He teaches them this in John chapter 15, verse 8. He says, this is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. Now, normally I take you from there right over to Galatians, the 5th chapter, and we talk about the fruits of the Spirit. The first fruit of the Spirit is love. And I believe that's how I tie all this together. Because look at the word that Jesus is going to tell them now. So, bear fruit. Now look at verse 9. As the Father has loved me, by the way, the word agape. As the Father has agape me, so have I agape you. Now remain in my agape. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my agape, just as I have obeyed my Father's command and remain in his agape. Can you see why John is called the apostle of love? He uses the word many more times than the rest of the gospel writers. In fact, he uses it more than the other gospel writers combined. But agape, the word agape is used throughout this. And isn't the world seeking happiness through love? Oh, yes. If I can just find my soulmate. Please don't use that term around me. It just makes my blood pressure rise. I'm getting older. That can be dangerous. So, my soulmate. Now, here's what Jesus said is the secret to joy and happiness. Look at verse 11. I have told you this about love and being obedient to God and remaining in his love as I have remained in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. See, our joy can never be complete without obedience to God and agape. Agape to God, agape for neighbors. Have you ever found somebody that was really happy and was just mad at everybody? Mad and happy don't go together. Mad and joy don't go together. High blood pressure and joy can go together because I'm pretty joyful and I have high blood pressure, so that can't genetic there. But folks, I want you to understand something. Obedience is linked to joy and love. And just for a moment, let's examine the necessity of obedience before God. Now, we're in John 15. We're coming back. Let's go back to 1 Samuel, the 15th chapter. 1 Samuel, 15th chapter. Saul is the king of Israel at the time. He was anointed king by a prophet named Samuel, one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. And Saul was this big 6-foot-plus guy, the head taller than everybody else, and literally the whole nation of Israel. And God says, Saul, I got a job for you. Go do this. And he doesn't do it exactly the way God tells him to do it. And Samuel calls him on it. And then Saul gives him this lame excuse. Well, I did this to honor your God. It was so funny. Not my God, but your God, Samuel. Here's what Samuel tells him. Chapter 15, starting verse 22. But Samuel replied to this lame excuse. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices? Now, it's not there from a... Guess what they did at the tabernacle every day? Sacrifices and burnt offerings. So God wants that, right? But here's what he says. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. To heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, which is forbidden, by the way, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Because you have not been obedient, you're done. You're gone. God needs Saul. God needs Ken. God needs you. God needs everybody to be obedient to his call. Look what King David found out about that. Now, King David, he was the successor of Saul. In fact, right after this, Samuel goes and anoints David to be the new king. But go to Psalm 51. Psalm 51. We got that lady calm down. You okay? I knew you were choking. It was good. So you got a good husband there. So Psalm 51. And this psalm was written after David was found out. A prophet named Nathan went up to David, and he was his prophet. He was the king's one of the king's advisors. And he tells him the story, and David got so mad. The story says, "Let's find that guy and put him in jail and whoop the tar out of him." And Nathan just pointed his big prophet's finger and says, "Thou art the man." The King James Version says, "You the guy, you the dude in the story." And David went, wow, because he had sex with a married woman. Then he had her husband killed to cover up his sin. Here's what David says as he's coming out of this, verse 16. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. Verse 17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. This from a man who just committed adultery and murder, who broke 2 of the 10 commandments in a short few months of his life. Folks, you cannot take love of God apart from obedience. They work together. Now let's go back to John 15 with obedience in mind. Let's reread the scriptures again, starting in verse 10. Remember what Jesus is saying? Bear fruit. Verse 10, if you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. Just real quick, how good was Jesus at following God's commands? How good? Perfect. Right on the money. Verse 11, I have told you this so that my joy may be complete. My joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. Obedience, love means complete joy. Verse 12. My command is this. Agape each other as I have agape you. Greater agape has no one than this, than he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. Are we comfortable?
Always come back at
No.
5:13.
We know better.
come
Don't
back
we?
at 5:13
Well, God, you don't know how I
instead of
feel. Is that going to work with Jesus?
First at my graduation.
Jesus came in the flesh. His own friend, one of his best friends, turns him in. Everybody rejected him and ran from him. The people he came to save were the very ones that said, crucify the bum. You can't say Jesus doesn't know how you feel.